Hi guys, Jimmy McIntyre here and welcome to a new episode of Challenge Jimmy. I know it's been quite a long time since I've done one of these, so you'll have to excuse me if I'm a little bit rusty. This image was sent in by Thomas Rodriguez Villegas. Gracias Thomas por enviarme esta foto tan bonita. I hope my Spanish skills aren't as rusty as my Challenge Jimmy skills. So if you're new to Challenge Jimmy series, this is where you, the subscriber, can send me your raw files and I'll process them in my style. And since many of us are isolating in our homes right now, we've got a bit of spare time. So I would like to create more of these videos. So by all means, send me your best raw files, your best images, and then I can process them and maybe give you a few new techniques along the way. Now, if you want to take part in Challenge Jimmy, you can see the email address coming up right now on your screen, or you can go to the description in YouTube of this video and you'll see the email address there. So this is Thomas's final edited image. He sent me some raw files which you'll look at later. And he said there were a couple of things he didn't like about it, but in particular was this white edging, which will be surprisingly easy to fix. And in fact, we're not going to fix this, we'll just avoid it completely by creating a slightly more natural dynamic between the brighter and darker exposures. I'm going to show you my final result with this image next, but I don't want to take anything away from Thomas's here. He's done a really good job of capturing an extremely sharp scene, so everywhere throughout the frame is sharp. His composition's extremely strong. He's filled the frame with interesting objects. And apart from the edging along the tree, he hasn't done a bad job at processing. But I want you to notice a couple of little things here. So Thomas has tried to compensate for the fact that he has an overcast sky. So naturally, with an overcast sky, we are going to have less detail throughout the scene because there's less light and fewer shadows, and those interactions will create more details. There's also going to be very little to no warmth because, of course, we haven't got a sun in the frame. But I think Thomas here has added a little bit of warmth. So we're not really looking at a cooler temperature here. And I think he's added some local contrast to these trees and other areas to try and give the image a little bit of kick. So let's look to see how I've done it differently. And again, I don't want anyone to think that I'm criticizing Thomas's. I think he's done a very good job here. So here's my version, which is very different to Thomas's in lots of different ways. Firstly, let's look at these trees here. You see we've got no edging whatsoever. It's quite a smooth blend. We have a cooler frame. So because this is overcast, I wanted to complement the mood that comes with an overcast sky, which would naturally be a cooler temperature. So it's a little bit bluer here in my frame. Next, my goal was to take the viewer's eye to the most interesting part of the frame as soon as they look at the photo, and that is the mountain range at the back. So I've lit up the mountain range. Then I've added a bit of contrast to the foreground and softly lit that foreground so that the viewer's eye will then drop to that area next. I've also reduced the local contrast or the details in the trees along here because I don't think they're adding anything to this frame. They are doing a great job at breaking up the interesting foreground and background, but they're distracting if they're a little bit bright. So I've kept them dark and the details soft. So I'm going to start the tutorial and bring the raw files into Photoshop now. So these are the raw files I'm going to use. Thomas actually sent me a few, but I think we only need two, and this brighter one will be our base exposure with the sky overexposed, and this darker one will recover the detail in the sky. Now, just to show you, I don't know whether or not it was windy that day or if something happened to the tripod because these two images aren't aligned, you see. They're in different locations. But we'll be able to fix that manually in Photoshop. And the reason why I'm going to do that manually is because I like to work with smart objects and we can't auto-align smart objects. Now in this tutorial, I'm not actually going to come back and edit in Adobe Camera Raw like I've done in previous tutorials. I'm going to do all the editing here and now. So we could turn these into rasterized layers, so not smart objects, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep this as a smart object just to show you how we can manually align layers. So first things first, this dark layer is a little bit too dark. Remember in my previous videos, I talk about something called matching. If we can kind of match our two exposures, our brighter exposure and darker exposure a little bit in terms of brightness, then we can often come out with a much more natural blend. And the good thing is, even though I'm going to bring up the exposure, let's say to about 1 on this darkest exposure, and I'm going to adjust the highlights, we're not going to create much image degradation because we're only going to take the best parts of this darker exposure and put that into the brighter exposure. And the rest of the image where there might be noise isn't going to be visible. So I've brought the highlights down to 43 just to recover those. I might bring them down a tiny bit more. Let's say minus 56. I'm going to bring up the shadows because they're a little bit dark. And I think that's about right. Then I'm going to go to this brighter exposure. And the only thing I want to do with this brighter exposure is bring along the clarity slider. You see, I want to add some local contrast, just a little bit, to this foreground here. So I'm going to bring that clarity slider up to about, let's say 30. We don't want to do that too much. Then I'm going to select these two exposures, go to Lens Corrections, remove chromatic aberration, and for some reason, when I choose Enable Profile Corrections, it says we're unable to locate a matching lens profile automatically. So I'm just going to untick that. Clearly, it doesn't have the information for that particular lens. Now I'm going to hold down Shift and click on Open Objects. So I'm going to stack these with Raya Pro 4. So we're going to do this tutorial like we did the previous tutorial. So I'm going to show you how to do all of this with Raya Pro and without Raya Pro. And the first step we're going to take is aligning these layers. So I've got the darkest layer on top and I'm going to choose a blend mode of difference. Now I'm going to select the Move tool, click once on this image here. Then I'm going to press my arrow keys up and down. You see I'm moving them around and that's moving the image. And in fact, I'm a little bit too far away from the image here. So I'm going to zoom in to these trees here. Then the Move tool again. And so I'm just trying to align everything up. That looks pretty good. When you see the harsh edging like this, that means they're misaligned. I think that looks perfect. Zoom out. Yes, you see we don't have any harsh white edges around now. So if I turn that back to normal, before and after, I think that is aligned. Let's zoom in again just to make sure. Now I think there's still a little bit of movement there, a little bit of space. So I don't think that's particularly good either. Perfect. Right. So with that aligned, I'm going to blend these exposures, and I'll do that by opening Instamask. Let's start with the brights one. So I'm looking to make a selection of the sky and a partial selection of the mountain. And I think that's not quite contrasting enough. You see, we've got the foreground selected in this mask as well, which doesn't matter too much because we are going to paint in the mask. So we can be selective about how we can apply it. So I think that looks okay. To make the selection and apply the mask to this darker exposure, we just press Select White. And that also selects a brush for us. I'm going to make sure I've got a big brush, and then I'm going to paint in the darker exposure. We could do that a couple of times to reinforce the selection. It's okay if it's a little bit dark, we can brighten that up later. Once that's done, I can press Command and D, and that deselects that active selection. Now, if you don't have Raya Pro, let me just delete that mask. I'll show you how to do this. I'm going to make this layer invisible. I'm going to create a curves layer with the mask of the curves layer selected. Go to Image, Apply Image, use the same settings as mine. Press OK. Select the darker exposure, hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and click on this Add a Mask icon, and that makes the darker exposure invisible. Now hold down Alt again on a PC or Option on a Mac and left click on this thumbnail and you'll see we have the mask. To make a better selection of the mask, press Command and L or Control and L, and that's a levels adjustment, and we can bring down the midtones, bring up the highlights, and you see we're trying to bring in more of the sky and the mountain. And then we can press OK if we're happy with that. Hold down Control and left click on that mask. You see we've just selected that selection. You can see the marching ants. Press Command and H or Control and H to hide those ants. Select the black mask of the darker exposure, and then we can paint in the mountain again. And remember to go over it a couple of times to reinforce the effect. And guys, when you do this, you should always have flow at 100%. That's really important. Then press Command and D or Control and D just to deselect that active selection. So I'm going to delete this curves layer because we don't need it anymore. That's how we blend exposures in Photoshop. As you can see, it's a lot quicker with Raya Pro, but you can set up some actions in Photoshop to speed that up for you. Now, just to show you, we've zoomed into this area. There is no haloing, no white edging at all. I would call that a perfect blend. Now we have some white edging all the way along here. This is where we aligned the layers, and I'm going to leave that for now and crop everything out later on. Now I forgot to do something when preparing the raw files, so I'm going to go back into Adobe Camera Raw and I'm going to add some cold temperature. You see I clicked on the base exposure, the brighter exposure, and that's because the brighter exposure has all the information in the foreground. And all I've done is reduce the temperature to 5600. So watch the change, very subtle. That's before we made the change and that's after. And again, I think that's complementing that colder scene that an overcast sky brings. So what do we do now? Well, I'm going to open a curves layer because I want to darken the sky a little bit more. I think it needs to be a little bit more dramatic. So I've brought down the upper midtones a little bit. I'm going to press Command and I or Control and I to invert the mask of that curves layer. And then I'm going to brush in that change, that contrast adjustment. So we're just adding a little bit more mood to the sky. Next, I want to brighten up the mountain range. And to do that, I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to change the blend mode of this layer to overlay. I'm going to set the opacity, let's say to 30% to start off with, and see what happens. With a white brush, and a smaller brush in fact, I'm going to paint along the mountain range. I'm going to reduce the opacity quite a bit. There's before and after. You see, we're just brightening that up a little bit. I'm going to create a mask, choose a black paintbrush and mask out these trees here because they were affected by that change too. So all we're doing is brightening those areas up. Now obviously this scene needs a little bit more contrast, so let's open up a levels layer and get our contrast right. I'm going to bring the highlight slider all the way along, get very bright. Then I'm going to pull this mid-tone slider to the right and that deepens the mood. And I'm looking particularly at the sky here. From there, I'm going to raise the black point. Just make it a little bit softer so we don't have any harsh shadows. There's before and after. Now my last video was called Ask Jimmy the Power of Vignettes, and that's on YouTube now, so pop on my channel and have a look at that. And I show you how to create vignettes. And this is something I teach a lot in my Art of Photography course and in my Jimmy's Big 5 Photos course. And let's just look at it now. So I'm opening up a curves layer, and just like I did before, I'm going to bring down the upper midtones and soften the shadows slightly. Now the point of a vignette is to tell the viewer where you want them to look. And clearly I want them to look at the mountain range and then the foreground with these buildings here. So everything outside of that isn't particularly important. It's just a mood deepener. So I'm painting in that curves layer. And I can do the same with these trees here and the same with these trees here. Now I think that's probably far too strong. So I'm going to make it a little bit softer, perhaps raise this black point a tiny bit more. Then I'm going to create another curves layer, brighten up the midtones this time. Press Command and I or Control and I with a white brush, paint that into this foreground here. And then I can group these layers, and there's before the vignette was added and after. Now I'm going to choose that darker layer again, and I am going to bring it down just a little bit more in the sky. But I think these trees left and right are a little bit too dark, so with a black brush at around a 30% opacity, I'm just painting some of that curves layer out. So there's before and after. That's a lot better. Next, I want to dodge and burn this foreground here. Just give it a little bit more life. And I'm going to do that destructively. Now, if you're a Raya Pro user, you can just open up the dodge and burn panel, press merge. That will create a new layer which has merged from all these layers below. Then you can choose the dodge tool or the burn tool. If you're not a Raya Pro user, I'm going to delete that. You can hold down Control, Alt, Shift and E, or Command, Option, Shift and E on a Mac, and that will do the same thing. And choose the dodge tool. And I'm going to dodge the highlights. So I've got the exposure set to 20%. And I'm going to try and avoid the buildings because they're already quite white. It probably won't make a massive difference anyway. I think that looks okay. And now I'm going to choose the burn tool, and I've got mid-tone selected and exposure 20. And I'm going to darken the mid-tones around this ridge here. You see it adds a little bit more depth to the foreground. And I'm just going to do that in some different places just to see if we can increase this kind of three-dimensional effect in the foreground. So it's before and after. See, there's a really big shift there in how we perceive this foreground. And if you think the greens are a little bit too green because of that effect, we can change the blend mode of that layer to luminosity. And you see we only affect the brightness levels and not the saturation of those layers. And thank you to the commenter in my last video who reminded me of this shortcut. Here is the before and after of what we've done. But we're not quite finished there. I want to add some extra detail in the mountains here. You see the very soft, the contrast, and that's fine. But I think some enhanced detail would make a difference. So how I'm going to do that, if you're a Raya Pro user, you can just go to your filter and finish tab and click on this detail enhance layer. I always leave the settings around 34 and 36 and press OK. You can see we've added a lot of local contrast there and it looks terrible. But with a black mask, I can manually paint in that area. Make sure my brush is set to 100. Watch the difference here to the mountain. This is before that change and after. I think that makes a huge difference. Now I'm going to take a black brush and just paint across the top of the mountains because that doesn't need any enhanced detail. And again, there's the before and after comparison. Obviously it's a little bit too strong, so we're going to knock down that opacity to around 50%. So there you go. So how do you do this if you don't have Raya Pro? Well, you can hold down Control, Alt, Shift and E, or Command, Option, Shift and E and do it again. So you've got two of those layers. The bottom layer we're going to leave as it is. The top layer we're going to change the blend mode of that to vivid light. We're going to group these two layers and we're going to change the blend mode of that group to overlay. Then with this layer that we changed to vivid light, we press Command and I or Control and I and we invert the layer and you see we've got our image back. Now we go to Filter, Blur, Surface Blur, and again those are the settings that I used before. We can press OK, and to mask those areas out on the group we can hold Alt and left click on the Add a Mask icon, and then we just paint in the mountain with a smaller brush, just as we did before. I really love this contrast adjustment. I think it's much better than the clarity slider in Adobe Camera Raw and better than any of the sharpen options that people use when adding contrast. I'm just going to undo the bit on these trees here. I think they're a little bit distracting. So there's before and after. I think that looks fantastic. Bring down the opacity a little bit. And this type of contrast adjustment often doesn't give massive halos like so many other ones do. And with that done, I like to finish most of my workflows with a levels layer, just to make sure we've got a decent spread of contrast. And actually, I think the contrast's fine here. We've got some strong highlights, we've got some decent shadows. So one thing left to do is crop tool and bring in that area that was cut off when we aligned these two exposures. Okay, so this is before and after. What a huge difference. So we started off with an overcast sky and a darker exposure as well, blended them in to come out with the scene that is overcast but extremely moody. As usual, I hope you found that enjoyable, and thank you very much again to Thomas for those great raw files. And if you want to take part in Challenge Jimmy, remember you can send me your raw files to the email address in the description of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.